The check tore with a sound louder than it should have been. Not a gunshot, not a scream, just paper, splitting cleanly down the middle, and yet in that quiet marble lobby, it landed like an explosion. Marcus Webb did not flinch. He stood there in his gray janitorial uniform, sleeves rolled to his forearms, damned, calloused from a decade of mop handles and floor buffers. And he watched the two halves of a $5 million check drift down onto the polished floor he himself had cleaned only hours before. Diane Kessler did not look at the paper as it fell. She looked at him, at the frayed collar, at the scuffed boots, at everything she'd already decided about him before he ever opened his mouth. "We don't process fraud here," she said, loud enough for the tellers to hear, loud enough for the shame to land exactly where she intended it to. Marcus said nothing. He simply knelt, gathered the two torn halves with the same steady hands that had once drawn blueprints for buildings that still stood in 3 American cities, and folded them gently into his pocket. He did not know yet that within 4 hours, the entire building would be in chaos. He did not know that the very system keeping the bank's billion-dollar merger alive was about to fail, and that only he would know why. He did not know his daughter would walk into that lobby at the exact moment his whole life turned inside out. What happened over the next few hours would change both of their lives forever. Before we begin, if you believe kindness, humility, and second chances can change the world, please take a moment to like this video. Comment where you're watching from. Share this story with someone who needs inspiration today. And subscribe to the Aura Fables for more unforgettable stories. To understand what happened in that lobby, you have to go back 3 years, to a quieter, harder version of Marcus Webb's life. Chicago in autumn is a city of glass and ambition, its skyline stitched together by the very towers Marcus once helped design, before he ever touched a mop. He was a structural engineer, the kind other engineers quietly admired. The kind whose calculations were trusted on buildings that would hold thousands of lives inside them. He had built a career on precision, on the belief that if you did the math right, the world would not fall down around you. Then his wife Renee was diagnosed with an aggressive illness that no amount of engineering could solve. For 18 months, Marcus split himself between hospital corridors and boardrooms, till there was no splitting left to do. He resigned from the firm that had once called him their best hire in a decade. He sold the patent to a load-bearing safety system he had invented in graduate school, the one piece of intellectual property that was entirely his, just to keep up with the treatments insurance wouldn't cover. It wasn't enough. Renee passed away on a gray February morning, leaving him with a 7-year-old daughter named Nadia, and a silence in the house that no engineering degree could calculate away. He did not return to the corporate world. He could not stomach the thought of missing another school recital, another skinned knee, another bedtime story, for a paycheck that could never buy back the years he'd already lost. So he took a job that asked nothing emotional of him, cleaning the marble floors of Ashford Sterling Trust's flagship Chicago branch, working nights so his days belonged entirely to Nadia. He told almost no one about his old life, not out of shame, but because he had learned that grief has a way of becoming a performance when other people know too much about it. Diane Kessler's story ran in the opposite direction. She had clawed her way into branch management through 80-hour weeks in an instinct for reading rooms who mattered, who didn't, who was worth her time. She had built an entire worldview around the idea that appearance was information, that a torn cuff or a tired face told you everything you needed to know about a person's worth. She was not cruel by nature. She was simply someone who had never once been forced to question that worldview, because it had never once failed her until the day it did. That morning, Marcus had come in during daylight hours before his shift, dressed exactly as he always was, carrying a check that represented the final settlement of a decade-long licensing dispute over the patent he'd once sold, a delayed royalty payment finally released. He wasn't there to make a scene. He was there to deposit it quietly and get back home before Nadia's bus arrived. Diane never asked a single verifying question. She saw a black man in a janitor's uniform holding a check for $5 million, and she made her decision before he'd said 10 words. The tearing of the check should have been the end of the story. It was, instead, only the beginning of a much larger unraveling, one that had nothing to do with Marcus at all, and everything to do with a fault line running quietly beneath the entire bank. Because at that very moment, 3 floors above the lobby, Ashford Sterling's executive boardroom, was in the final hour of finalizing a $2.3 billion acquisition, a merger that had taken 14 months, 3 law firms, and half the bank's senior leadership to negotiate. Regional President Adrian Cole was on a video call with the acquiring firm's board when the transaction network went dark. Not slow, not glitchy, dark. Every terminal in the building froze, mid-transaction. Collateral verification system stalled. The merger's entire financial backbone, the automated ledger reconciliation platform the bank had quietly built, its infrastructure around, seized without warning, threatening to collapse a deal 14 months in the making. Live in front of the very board members being asked to trust the bank with their money. Panic moved through the executive floor like a current. IT contractors who billed $400 an hour stood over blinking terminals with no answers. Senior vice presidents who had built careers on confident language suddenly had none. Someone floated the word unrecoverable. Someone else floated the word lawsuit. Adrian Cole, sweating through a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, kept repeating the same sentence to the acquiring firm's board. We're working on it. They were not working on it. Nobody in that room understood what it even was. Downstairs, Marcus had returned to his cart, his shift beginning early because a coworker had called out sick. He moved through the lobby quietly, the humiliation of an hour earlier folded away with the torn check still in his pocket. When he overheard 2 panicked analysts arguing near the elevator bank about a catastrophic infrastructure fault nobody could diagnose, he didn't mean to listen. But something in the description, the specific way they described the failure, a redundancy collapse in a fail-safe layer, struck a nerve he hadn't touched in years. It sounded, unmistakably, like the exact architecture of the safety system he had designed and patented over a decade ago. The one licensed out to financial infrastructure firms long after he'd stopped tracking where it ended up. He tried to approach a security guard near the elevator to ask a simple question: which server cluster the failure originated from? He was stopped before he finished the sentence. Employees only pass this point, the guard said, glancing at his uniform. You're not cleared for the executive floor. Marcus stepped back without argument. He had spent years being told, in 100 quiet ways, that his knowledge no longer counted for anything. He simply returned to his cart and kept working, the answer sitting fully formed in his mind, while an entire floor of executives searched for it in the dark. What turned the tide was not Marcus stepping forward, it was a photograph. A young teller named Priya, unsettled by what she'd witnessed that morning, had quietly photographed the torn halves of the check before Marcus picked them up, not out of suspicion of him, out of a growing unease about Diane. When she mentioned it to her supervisor an hour later, half joking, half worried about liability, the supervisor's face changed. He recognized the name printed faintly across the check stub. Marcus Webb, a name he'd seen once before, buried in a compliance filing tied to the bank's parent holding company, a filing few branch employees had clearance to read, listing a controlling shareholder whose identity had been kept deliberately quiet at his own request. The supervisor made 2 calls in quick succession. One to compliance, one directly to Adrian Cole's assistant, interrupting the crisis upstairs with 4 words that stopped the room cold. Right, you need to come down. Cole arrived at the lobby already unsettled, only to freeze completely at what he saw: the branch's night janitor calmly wiping down a counter, while executives 3 floors up were unraveling over a system failure with no explanation. Mr. Webb, Cole said, and the word that followed landed with a weight the entire lobby felt. Sir. Diane, standing several feet away, went pale. Cole explained in front of the stunned floor staff what almost no one at the branch level had ever known: that Marcus Webb was not merely a depositor, and certainly not a fraud. He held a majority stake in the holding company that owned Ashford Sterling Trust itself, a quiet, deliberately anonymous position he'd taken years earlier when he sold the very safety system patent that, it turned out, the bank's failing infrastructure had been built upon without most executives ever tracing its origin. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply asked calmly to see the failing system. Within 20 minutes, standing in a boardroom full of men and women who had ignored him for years without knowing it, Marcus walked the terrified IT team through the exact redundancy. Failure, a fail-safe layer that had been patched incorrectly during a recent update, collapsing under the merger's transaction load, He didn't need documentation. He'd written the original architecture from memory a decade earlier. Within the hour, the system was stable. The merger and the $2.3 billion resting on it was saved. The boardroom, full of people who moments earlier had been drowning in panic, rose to their feet in a stunned, unplanned standing ovation. And it was in that exact moment that Nadia walked into the lobby downstairs for her usual after-school pickup, only to be gently guided upstairs by Priya, arriving just in time to see her father, still in his worn work uniform. Hands still calloused, dignity fully intact, finally being seen, applauded, and thanked by an entire room of people who had never once bothered to ask who he really was. Tears welled in her eyes, not from surprise, but from a quiet, aching pride she had always carried for him in private, now finally shared by everyone else in that room. Diane Kessler's apology, when it came, was not the polished corporate kind. It was quiet, halting, and delivered privately to Marcus the following week, in the same lobby where she had torn his check in half. She did not ask for forgiveness. She simply admitted plainly that she had looked at him and seen nothing worth respecting, and that the mistake would sit with her for the rest of her career. In the months that followed, Ashford Sterling quietly overhauled its verification procedures, no longer permitting frontline staff to make snap judgments based on appearance alone. Diane, to her credit, requested to lead that retraining herself. Determined that her failure would become someone else's lesson, Marcus was offered a formal advisory seat on the holding company's board, a position he accepted on one condition: that the bank establish a permanent fund supporting the education and advancement of its lowest-paid employees. The janitors, tellers, and overnight staff who moved invisibly through buildings like his, unseen and undervalued. He kept his night shifts a little longer, not out of necessity, but because the quiet hours still belonged to him and to Nadia's mornings. Eventually, he stepped back only when he was ready, on his own terms, in his own time. True greatness, it turns out, was never measured by the size of a paycheck or the cut of a suit. It was measured all along in the quiet dignity of a man who kept showing up for his daughter even when the world refused to see him. And in the humbling truth that every person we pass without a second glance may be carrying a battle, a brilliance, or a whole life we know nothing about.